Welcome back to the garden. Last week on our soul retrieval journey, episode 3, we walked through the Jung's lens, the shadow episode. We talked about Carl Jung's framework for the psyche, the idea that the parts of you that went underground did not just go because they were wrong. They went because the environment could not hold them, and that the path to wholeness, what Jung called individuation, is not the elimination of the shadow, it is the union with it. We discussed that lens over our story of age 12, the death of a father, grief with nowhere to go, an unnamed fierce one beginning to stir. The shadow part that rose and said, "If no one will protect me, I will protect myself." The knife that followed, and then the system responding the way they do to a child in crisis when there's no language to call it what it actually is. I was placed on a CHINS order. For those of you who are not from Massachusetts or who have not been inside the juvenile systems, CHINS, CHINS, stands for Child in Need of Services. It sounds like help. It is not. It is a legal designation that places a child under court supervision, technically designed for youth who are truant, runaway, or labeled beyond parental control. It turned me from a child in crisis into a child with a record. From a girl who needed someone to reach in, into a case number that needed to be managed. That, and everything that followed, is where last week's episode left her. Systems and streets, group homes and juvie lockups, nowhere safe. Today, we move forward. But before we go further, I want to say something about Jung directly. His map of the psyche is vast. We have been walking through one door of it this season, the shadow, also known as the demonized protector, the repressed parts of self, the lower self that rose to keep the whole system alive. But Jung mapped so much more. Many archetypes such as the hero, the trickster, the great mother, the wise old man, the anima and animus, the divine child, each one a living pattern in the collective unconscious, each one showing up in every culture, every mythology, every human story ever told. Each one living inside your system in some form. Maybe that can be a whole other season of this journey, a whole other wing of the garden. Comment if you want to go deeper into the full Jungian architecture and how it maps out to the Trinity of Self within you. Those seeds can be planted, but only if you want to tend it. Today, we move into episode 4, and we are moving into new territory. This is the IFS episode, the Internal Family Systems, Lens 3 on our website, and the many names before the Trinity of Self. The names that carried her through the years between 12 and 2018. For now, for those who are new, let me introduce myself. I'm Isa Rose Sophia Ramos. I'm the founder of Sprout from Darkness, Soul Purpose Retrieval, Overcoming Unaddressed Trauma. I'm a psychology student, and I'm receiving a scholarship training in the spirituality of internal family systems directly with Dr. Richard C. Schwartz, the founder of IFS, through Sound True Foundation. This story is not mine alone. It is ours. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 4. Before we move forward, I want to ask you something. And I mean, actually ask you. Is there a version of yourself you have been ashamed of? A chapter you skip over when you tell your story? A name you carried? Maybe not necessarily literally, maybe a role, a face, a version of yourself you became because the room and survival required it? A part of you that you have been holding as evidence of how broken you are? Let's hold that space. Because that version of you, that chapter, that name, that face, that persona, that mask is not evidence of your damage. It is evidence of your survival. We are on our soul retrieval journey, yours and mine, walking the same terrain from different points on the path. Our story is a vehicle. Your wholeness is the destination. Every piece of testimony is a waypoint on the map, and the teaching framework is the language. With the triple goddess, Trinity of Self, adds the mirrors. The triple goddess, Trinity of Self guides through the inner garden. Gypsy Jinx Nix, the tender wounded inner child, the earth angel who went underground when the world could not hold the softness, the higher self that went into exile. Lucia de Lilith, the shadow protector who arose when the soul needed it most, the lower self from the depths of darkness. Issa Rose Sophia, the integrated whole self with a capital S, the balance of the yin-yang energy, the sacred union of the higher and the lower, and one with all parts. The sovereign destination this season is walking towards. They are archetypes, mirrors. The Trinity of Self exists in some form inside every human system. The tender exiled one, the fierce protective one, the integrated whole. We are here to help you find and reclaim them in yourself. Our soul integration framework on our website highlights 3 lenses, traditions that each arrived independently to the same truth about what happens when the soul experiences trauma and what it takes to call its true essence back home. Lens 1, Shamanic Soul Retrieval, as we discussed in episode 2, the oldest healing wisdom on earth. When trauma happens, pieces of the soul scatter. They go somewhere safe, and healing is the intentional work of calling those fragmented parts back home. Lens 2, as we discussed in our last episode, is the Jungian shadow work. You were born whole. Parts went underground because the environment could not hold them. Wholeness is the union of the shadow, not the elimination. Lens 3, this episode, is the internal family systems. The mind is naturally multiple. Every part has a positive intent. There are no bad parts. And at the center of the whole system is a self with a capital S that cannot be damaged, has always been there, and knows how to heal. 3 lenses, 1 map. Soul retrieval is where they all point. If you are new here, the full soul integration framework lives at sproutfromdarkness.com, linked in the description. Go read it. And the origin story, the many names before the Trinity of Self. That is the written arc of everything this season is walking through. Go explore that part of the garden after this episode. Now, for a quick recap. Episode 1, The Garden is Replanted, asked, what are the pieces of you that have been scattered? What went underground when the world could not hold it? Episode 2, when did your first piece leave? When was your first fragmentation that resulted in soul loss? What were you carrying when something in you decided it was not safe to stay fully present? Episode 3, what part of you rose in your hardest season? What got loud when quiet stopped working? What did the world call dangerous that was actually the only protector who showed up? And it handed you a question to carry into this week. If your most protective part had a name, what would it be? Have you been reflecting on that? If so, comment below or join our community on Facebook at Sprouted Soul Reflections. The many paths of the garden are waiting for you. We are at the midpoint of this season's hero's journey. In every soul retrieval, across every tradition, there is a descent, a wandering in the dark, and then a turn toward home. Currently in our story, we are in the wandering. Before we go into the testimony, we want to give you some more seeds, a framework, a language, not because you need a degree to understand what happened to you, but because it's part of the retrieval. When you can name what happened, it stops having power over you that you cannot see. Which leads into what many of you have already heard me mentioning, my scholarship that I applied for and received to study the spirituality of internal family systems directly with Dr. Richard C. Schwartz, the founder of IFS, through Sounds True Foundation. This is not sponsored. Nobody paid me to say this. I applied because something in me knew that what Dr. Schwartz was teaching was the clinical home for everything I had already been living. If what we share today resonates with you, go experience it directly through Sounds True, linked in the description below. What I share here is my own brief synthesis, my testimony filtered through the clinical language this training gave me. Here's what Internal Family Systems says about you. The mind is naturally multiple, not broken, not disordered, multiple. Every person carries an inner system of parts, an internal family system, different voices, different roles, different ways of responding to the world. Some parts are wounded. Some parts protect the wounded ones. And at the center of the whole system, beneath all the fragmentation, unreachable by trauma, impossible to destroy, is the self. Again, capital S. The self cannot be damaged. The self has always been there, and the self knows how to heal. Here is the clinical language for the parts. The exiles are the wounded parts, the ones carrying unbearable feelings, grief, shame, terror, the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with them. When trauma happens, these parts go underground, not because they are weak, because the feeling is too large for the system to hold in the open. In our Trinity of Self framework, Gypsy is the exile, the wounded earth angel gone underground, the higher self in hiding. Managers are the parts that keep the exile's pain from surfacing. They control the presentation. They wear the right face. They make sure nobody gets close enough to see what is really underneath. The survival names were managers: Ruby, Honey, Karma, the right face for the right room. And we're going to discuss them soon. Firefighters are the parts that rush in when the exile's pain surfaces anyway. They do whatever it takes, immediately, urgently, without regard for consequences. Their job is to extinguish that fire. Lucia de Lilith is the firefighter, the part that ran the show in the rooms the real self could not safely enter. And here's what IFS says about all of these parts. The exiles, the managers, the firefighters. That changes everything about how you understand your own story. Every single one has a positive intent, not some of them. Every single one. The exile is protecting the original wound by containing it. The manager is protecting the exile by controlling the presentation. The firefighter is protecting the exile by doing whatever survival requires. There are no bad parts, which is the title of Dr. Schwartz's book, and I'll link that also in the description under reading recommendations. There are only parts running impossible jobs without support, without relief, without anyone ever asking, what are you protecting? What are you afraid would happen if you put this down? Do you know the emergency is over? Now, why do you feel broken even when you are trying to heal? There's a few layers to this. The first is what IFS identifies as a cultural wound. Over centuries, the Western world developed a drive to dominate, achieve, master, control. And in doing so, it exiled the very wisdom that makes profound suffering survivable. The ceremonies, the wisdom keepers, the intergenerational healing practices, the knowing that you are not alone. Indigenous communities still have those structures. The Western world dismantled them and called it progress. The reason you feel cut off from your own inner knowing is not because you are defective. It is because you were raised inside a paradigm that severed that connection with and called it constructive. Your disconnection from yourself is cultural inheritance, not personal failure. The second layer is the view of human nature you absorb. Most survivors of trauma absorb, consciously or not, the belief that people are basically bad or a threat, that something is wrong at the core, that the survival responses, the names, the roles, the things you did to get through, those are evidence of your damage. IFS says something completely different, something every wisdom tradition that has ever gotten it right has also said. There is an inherent goodness in every human being that is not relative to this world. It is not earned. It is not conditional. It is the self with a capital S, the imago Dei, the Buddha nature, the Neshama, the Atman, the Great Spirit, the Divine Spark. Different names, one universal truth. The wounds and the survival strategies do not create that essence. They cover it. That means healing is not about building something that was never there. It is about uncovering something that never left and was just buried under who the world told you you are or made you feel ashamed to authentically be. And that is why you are not broken. You are fragmented. And those are not the same thing. Broken means something is wrong at the core. Fragmented means the original wholeness exists and the pieces can be gathered. The third layer, and this one I want to hold very carefully. IFS addresses something that Dr. Schwartz kept quiet about for decades because he was afraid it would discredit the clinical model. He calls them unattached burdens, what shamanic traditions call entities, what religious traditions call spiritual warfare, what many trauma survivors describe as something that feels like an external force working against them. Dr. Schwartz, the committed skeptic, the trained scientist, said he could not deny this after encountering it repeatedly across decades of clinical work. And what he says about how to address it is this. Self-energy is a protective shield. When you are in self, when the parts are open enough to allow that warm, grounded, vibrating presence to fill your system, there is no access point. Self-energy is the protection that every spiritual tradition has been pointing toward under different names. The armor of God, the pure white light, the shamanic shield, the sacred holy fire. It does not require ritual or aggression to work. It requires you to come home to yourself, which is what this entire journey is about. And here is what the self actually feels like when it is present. Dr. Schwartz describes self-energy not as a concept, but as a physical sensation, a warmth, a vibrating aliveness, a spaciousness that opens when the parts step back far enough. He describes 8 qualities that naturally emerge when the self is given enough space to lead. He calls them the 8 C's: calmness, curiosity, compassion, confidence, creativity, courage, clarity, connectedness. Not achievements, not the reward for enough healing. What naturally surfaces when the emergency response team finally feels safe enough to stand down. And the quantum physics metaphor, I want you to carry into the names. Photon exists as both particle and wave. You, your individual life, your specific wounds and names and survival strategies are a particle. But you are a particle of something much larger, a drop of a bigger ocean, connected to the greater self. What some traditions call God, others call the divine, others call the Great Spirit, the monad, the unified field of consciousness. You are not separate from the larger life. The microorganism is not separate from the macroorganism. You are a concentrated expression of it. And the retrieval of your fragments is not just personal business. It is the wave calling its particle home to the supreme self. And one more thing before we go into the testimony. Legacy burdens. These are the extreme beliefs and emotions that get passed down through families and cultures, not through conversation, through the body, through epigenetics, through the way a parent's or grandparents' unresolved terror can become a child's hypervigilance before that child ever knows what the parents survived. Some of what drove Jackie Rose into the survival names was not even her original wound. It was older, inherited, carried in the body before she even had a name. The full story of that lineage belongs to the upcoming books. What belongs here is this. Some of what you are carrying was never yours to begin with, and what was never yours to begin with can be returned. Now that you have all that language, let's go into the testimony. Between Jackie Rose and Issa Rose Sophia, there were many names. Not always chosen identities, not philosophy, working names. Names the industry handed her, or someone in her orbit suggested, and she took them because sometimes that's how the world works. Let me give you the context first. From 12 to 17, she was in and out of juvenile systems, on the run, in programs, bouncing between friends and strangers. She shuffled through schools. From the Catholic schoolgirl to Student's Choice at Longmeadow High, where she made the cheerleading squad, but then was kicked out. Then to Central High, where she made the cheerleading team again and kept fighting and going truant, so she was transitioned to Putnam while on the run. Then she ended up finally landing at an alternative high school. She was supposed to graduate from Longmeadow in 2003. She graduated from Springfield High School in 2002. A year early, despite everything, because a guidance counselor reached in and refused to let her drop out. I want to stay there for a moment. That guidance counselor is something IFS and the shamanic tradition have both been pointing at. Dr. Schwartz describes guides, the loving presence, the spiritual support, the ancestors and helpers that indigenous traditions have always known are present. He says they do not wait for us to be ready. They travel alongside. They reach through when there is an opening. Sometimes a guide looks like an ancestor spirit, and sometimes a guide looks like a person who sees a girl everyone else has written off and says, "You are not dropping out. I will help you get across this finish line. You just have to do the work." That counselor was a guide. The self was reaching through, even then. After graduating, she worked as a dietary aide at Mercy Hospital. A decent job, a legitimate life within reach. But a nervous system trained by years of chaos and systems and streets does not know how to stay in something slow and decent. Not without anyone ever having sat with her and said, "Here's what happened to you. Here's why your body does this. Here's how we tend it." That wisdom was not available to her then. And so, the pull toward fast money, towards environments that felt familiar even when they were dangerous and unsafe, that pull was not a character flaw. That was an untended nervous system doing exactly what it had been trained to do. There is more to those years than this episode can hold. The full story will be in upcoming books and future seasons of The Garden. What belongs here right now is she kept reaching between every name, between every survival season, and the forces working against her had been circling ever since she was a child. Now, for the names. Ruby, suggested by someone in that world, named for the color of her hair at the time, ruby red. That is the whole story of how Ruby arrived. Her environment handed her a name, and she took it. That is how most manager parts get their first assignment. Not from a conscious choice, not from a strategy designed from awareness. The environment hands you a role. Your system looks at it and says, "I can do this. I can be this. If being this means we survive this, then this is what we are." And the part takes the job. Without training, without support, without anyone asking what it costs. Ruby was a manager, controlled presentation, the right face for the right room, keeping Jackie Rose, keeping Gypsy safe behind the name Ruby, while the stirring shadow became a storm in the spaces that required her. There was no deeper meaning in Ruby at the time. She was just a name that worked. Ask yourself, what was your Ruby? What face did the environment hand you that you put on because it required it? Honey, sweet, pourable, something that flows out of you and becomes someone else's possession. That name was not chosen for its poetry. It was also a working name in the industry. But even a name chosen without intention carries something, a part rushing in to manage through whatever means were available, keeping the exile from flooding the whole system. And underneath Honey, the exile was still there, quiet in the dark, holding everything that could not be held safely in front of anyone else. Honey was running the job that included wounds she did not even choose. Ask yourself, what was your honey? What did you offer? What did you become that kept the worst from happening, even at cost to yourself? Rosa, Odessa, Texas. Rosa, Rose, Issa Rose. I have sat with that name progression many times because even in survival, even in the middle of fragmentation so complete that Jackie Rose was barely accessible, something in the naming was circling home without her knowing it. She was not choosing Rosa because she sensed it was pointing toward Issa Rose. She was just a girl in Odessa with a rose tattoo, and that was what people called her. But from here, from the other side of the spiral, we can see it. The way roots find water in the dark, the self reaching down through a memory given by a middle name to a little girl. Ask yourself, where in your own survival did something true slip through without you choosing it? Next was Karma in Lubbock, Texas. Another suggestion by someone she knew, and she took it. Again, no deep meaning at the time, just a name someone offered and a mask she wore. But here's what I find extraordinary looking back. Even in a name chosen casually, the soul was doing something. Karma, the belief that there is a balance, that surviving long enough tips the scales, that there is an accounting happening at a level you cannot always see. Now, before we get into Serenity Delve, there's something I want you to see in your mind's eye. On my right inner forearm, there is a tattoo. A girl, pinup style hairdo, and all you can see is from her bare shoulders up. She's wearing ruby dangling earrings, crying, and what falls from her eyes is not tears. It is honey. She has dollar signs for the pupils. Behind her, a honeycomb. Below it on the wrist, a blue rose. I got that tattoo after those names, while I was still inside the survival season, before I knew where the story was going. It is not just a memory preserved in ink from the healed side of the journey. It is the soul encoding the map before she knew what it was. Before Issa Rose Sophia existed. Before the integration. Before the framework. Before the Trinity of Self. Something in her already knew those names needed to be held somewhere permanent. That is the self reaching through, even then, even before she had a name for what she was doing. Maybe some of you have already seen the tattoo from previous content in our ecosystems on other platforms. For those who haven't, you will see it this summer, when the Trinity of Self Triple Goddess arrives on camera. Stay aligned on divine time and keep your eye on the garden. So now, the one that was different from all the others, Serenity Delve. This name she consciously chose. It was not suggested by someone else. It was not handed by an environment. It means to search and dig for peace. Let's really reflect on that for a moment. Out of all the names, Ruby, Honey, Rosa, Karma, all the working names, the industry handed them or someone suggested them, the survival mask worn because it required that face, Serenity Delve was more than a working name. It was a prayer. Out of everything available to her, she chose a name that meant she was still looking, still searching, still digging. She was still carrying that name in 2018 when everything broke open. When the arrest happened, when the system that had always criminalized her became, in the most painful and contradictory way possible, the same instrument of something that can only be described as intervention. That story is next week. All of it. The arrest, the rescue, the prophetic messages that followed. The moment the systems that had always called her the criminal became the thing that finally intervened. But before we get there, notice something. Even in the darkest chapters, even when survival was the only language available, the part running the show chose a name that meant, I'm still looking. I'm still in here and I haven't stopped looking. Even through this. Even in this darkness. That is the self reaching through. Even then. Even then. I want to reframe something that this entire episode has been building toward. Every tradition that has ever taken the inner life seriously, every philosophy, every theology, every psychology, every wisdom lineage across the entire history of human consciousness trying to understand itself or the self, they all describe the same triadic movement. The higher self descends. A piece of the original wholeness goes underground, not because it is broken, but because the world cannot hold it. The shamans call it soul loss. The Gnostics call it the divine spark trapped in matter. The Vedic traditions call it the Atman, forgetting the identity with Brahman. Christianity calls it the fall. Jung calls it the ego losing contact with the self. IFS calls it the exile going underground. Different languages, same first movement. That is Gypsy, the exiled earth angel, the higher self gone underground, the light waiting in the darkness. Then the protection rises. When the tender part goes underground, a fierce part rises to keep the whole system alive. The shamans call it the protective spirit. Jung calls it the shadow. IFS calls it the firefighter. Every tradition has had to reckon with this part. The ones that got it right understood this is not the villain. It is the guardian. Again, different languages, same second movement. That is Lucia de Lilith, the demonized shadow protector, the lower self risen from the depths of the darkness. And then the integration, the soul retrieval, the sacred union of the higher self and the lower self into one whole being that contains and transcends them both. The shamanic soul retriever, reclaiming the lost soul parts, the Jungian individuation realized, the IFS self-energy finally leading, the Christ consciousness embodied, the Atman remembering its identity with Brahman, the divine spark of Sophia returned to the pleroma. Different languages, same third movement. That is Isaro Sophia, the integrated self, the yin-yang energy, the one who holds both shine and shadow and says, I am made of both of you. I am one with all of you, and I am whole. The Trinity of Self framework is not a personal brand. It is part of the oldest story on earth, told through teaching and testimony, so you can find your own parts and call them home on your own hero's journey. Again, in our Trinity of Self framework, Gypsy is the mirror to your higher self, the part of you that went underground when the world could not honor it. That part is in you. That part has always been in you and is waiting. Lucia de Lilith is the shadow protector. That's the part that rises to keep you safe, the part the world called dangerous. That part is in you. That part has always been in you, and it deserves to be integrated. Not an exorcism, not eliminated, integrated. The sacred union. That is not just my destination, that is yours on our soul retrieval journey. Now I want to speak directly to you. Maybe some of you found this garden through our recent Facebook reel, a short video where I told you we had been gone for the winter, or on our hero's journey, that it started way before the winter, that it started with a little girl who was whole before the world shattered her, who was never meant to be caged, whose wings were always there. And we mentioned a reblooming. What we did not say, and what we want to say now, is that we were not just talking about me, we were also talking about you. As you keep hearing, this is your soul retrieval. This is your hero's journey. We use our story as the map to help you navigate the territory. The shamans call it soul loss and retrieval. You descend. Pieces scatter. The retriever goes in after them. You return with what was lost. Jung calls it individuation. The ego descends into the shadow. It loses what it thought it was. It finds what it actually is. It comes home whole. IFS calls it unburdening. The parts took on impossible roles, and when there is finally enough space, the unburdening begins. Christianity calls it resurrection. You go into the tomb, and something that could not be killed by any of it rises. The Caged Bird, and some of you know this poem, keeps singing of freedom. Wings clipped, feet tied, the cage built not from iron, but from the accumulated weight of every wound that said, you are not allowed to be fully yourself here. But that song does not stop. That song never stops. Because the self cannot be caged permanently. It was never designed to be. The child, whoever the original whole version of you was, before the world started making decisions about which parts of you were allowed to exist, they are still there. Underneath every version of you you've carried, every role the environment handed you, and every mask you had to wear because the room required it. And the reblooming, that is not something we can do for you. That is what happens when you finally stop running from the pieces of yourself that have been waiting in the dark and turn around and say, I see you. I know what you have been holding. It is safe to come home now. And that is soul retrieval. That is the hero's return. That is the triadic movement completed. The exile called home, the protector integrated, the self leading and shielding, the whole essence. Your parts are waiting, not for you to be finished or perfect or fixed, not for the shame to be resolved and the story to be clean. They are waiting for an opening, for you to turn toward them and ask, what are you protecting? What are you afraid would happen if you put this down? Do you know I am here now? Do you feel safe? Because often, simply being asked is enough to begin the thawing. Remember, you are not broken, you are fragmented, and fragments can be gathered into wholeness. Next week, episode 5, Serenity Delve, the arrest, the rescue, the prophetic messages, the moment the system that had always criminalized her became the instrument of something that can only be described as intervention. In the meantime, tend your inner garden with our free 7-day soul retrieval journal. It's in the shop, link in the description. Also explore the Soul Spiral Journal, available through the Gypsy Emporium storefront, the Gathered Fragments companion blog for this week, the Soul Integration Framework, the 3 lenses, the 1 map, and the origin story lives all on sproutfromdarkness.com. Join our Facebook community, Sprouted Soul Reflections. Come find us and plant a seed. The Spirituality of IFS training with Dr. Richard C. Schwartz through Sound's True Foundation is also linked in the description. Again, not sponsored. I received a scholarship. Join the waitlist to experience it directly. I'm truly grateful for this training. It is enlightening. If this episode found you where you needed it, share it. The person who needs this may not know where to go searching for it. Someone who loves them has to show them the path. So, those were the names, the survival masks. Every single one was protecting something precious, and the self was reaching through all of them the entire time with roots and reverence, petals and thorns. This is Sprouted Reflections of Issa Rose, Season 2, episode 4 of our soul retrieval adventure. Our hero's journey continues next weekend. The garden is here.